Today, let's go over some tips and tricks for sewing curves so that you get that perfect curve every time. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are talking about sewing on a curve. So while a lot of the times when we're sewing it is straight lines, sometimes we have to sew on a curve, and this is actually a little sneak peek into a new project and pattern I have coming out soon, but there is a curve involved. So today we are going to be talking about some tips and tricks and guidance so that you can get a nice curve whenever you need to sew on a curve. And we are going to be starting off with the prep work. So as you can see here, I have this curve and then I have two pieces of fabric that I have pinned together. And the first step when you're sewing on a curve, it is so important to always make sure you have your fabric pinned or clipped in some way. So these pins are actually holding our fabric so that we start off sewing the straight line and then our fabric starts to curve. And when it starts to curve, we want to make sure that when we're at the sewing machine, the fabric isn't puckering too much, it's not getting in our way. So as you can see on this side, I have not added as many pins and the fabric isn't really laying as nicely. So one way that we are going to correct this is just by adding more pins. This is going to help us so much when we go to our sewing machine, as we will be able to not have to worry as much about how is our fabric laying, but everything is going to be staying put. So now that we have this done, we're able to actually go over to our sewing machine and begin the process of sewing that curve. So for the setup of your sewing machine, nothing really too crazy is needed. I have my regular presser foot and I have my needle and it's all threaded. And now I'm going to add whatever I'm going to be sewing. So this is that heart that I was going to be sewing. As you can see, I have the edge of my fabric lined up with the edge of the presser foot. And this is just going to allow me to see the exact seam allowance. We want to make sure as we're sewing that edge stays the same. Now if you have a larger seam allowance, you're just going to want that edge of your fabric to match up with whatever seam allowance guide you are using. And then our left hand is going to be kind of guiding our fabric through. So it's really important that you follow that curve while we are sewing this. Now when you are doing the curve, there's a couple of different tricks that you can use if you are really struggling with making sure your fabric is following that curve as you're sewing. So the first is you can actually keep your left hand on your fabric and just sort of guide and pivot it as you sew along. So you want to go really slowly and just very carefully guide your fabric so that you're making sure you're following that line along the edge. The fabric is lined up with whatever seam allowance you're using. Now in addition, you can actually shorten your stitch length. So if it's normally at around 2.5, you could shorten it to about a 1.5. Smaller stitches are going to make it easier for that sewing. Now when it comes time to maybe switch the direction of your curve, so in this instance I'm sewing a heart, so I have to now lift up my presser foot with my needle in the fabric and pivot my fabric to wherever the next curve is starting. So again, you can see that I have that presser foot lined up with the edge of my fabric, and I am just going to begin sewing. Now the last tip I will give you for actually sewing is you can actually do little pivots along the way. So as you can see here, I'm starting my seam and then I'm stopping when I feel like I need to readjust. And this just allows you another way that you can readjust that curve, making sure everything is laying nice and flat and smooth. You can also use your hands while you're going along, just making sure that your fingers are kind of pressing out your fabric so that they are all laying nice and flat, so that you don't have to worry about any puckering in your fabric along the way. Once you feel pretty comfortable though, as you can see I've sped up this video, you're able to then just continue sewing your curve. So I have my seams for my curve done for both of these hearts, but unfortunately we still have another step when it comes to sewing curves and getting them to lay nice and flat and smooth. Now we need to actually clip and create notches in our fabric. So in that seam allowance where you saw that the two directions of the curves were changing, I just clipped that part and then I'm going through and creating little notches. Now I'm doing this because this is a convex curve. So as you see that heart, we have that curve that's sort of like jutting out from our fabric. I'm going through and cutting out these little triangles. Now for these triangles, I'm getting as close to the seam as I can without cutting through the seam. And the reason we want to do this is when we turn this right side out, all of that fabric is going to be coming together for our seam allowance, and it's going to sort of make it bulky, which we don't want. So creating these little notches gives that seam allowance fabric someplace to go when we turn this right side out. So now that I have those little notches in place, I'm just going to turn this heart so that you can see that it actually is laying really nice and smooth now. and we are able to use this for whatever purposes we need to. So you can see we have those really nice curves that are going on that attached really nicely to those straight lines. Now, I mentioned that that was a convex curve, so here we have convex, but what if we have something like concave? So as you can see here, we kind of have this curve that goes in and then out. So a concave curve is very similar. All the same sewing techniques would apply: pivoting, shorter stitch length, guiding with your hands. But once we have that seam done, now we have to prep that seam very similar to how we did earlier by cutting out those notches. So for example, for that convex curve, I'm cutting out the notches like before. But now for this concave one, we're not actually going to be cutting out notches, but instead just cutting little snips into the fabric. So again, not going into the seam itself, but just giving it so that there's room for this curve to sort of grow. And what I mean by that is when we press this and turn this right side out, because it's that concave, the fabric actually is going to be sort of stretching, and having that little clip there is going to allow it to stretch so that it can lay nice and flat and smooth for us. So as you can see here, we have our two curves. So we have that nice convex curve where it's laying nice and flat and smooth, where we cut out these little triangles, and then we also have our concave curve where we just did those snips. So this allowed the fabric to stretch so that it can lay nice and smooth as well. I hope this helped you with how to sew on a curve. If it did, be sure to let me know. What other sewing on a curve tips do you have? Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.